And Madam Chairman, thanks for joining us again. I want to follow up on the line of discussion that Senator Corker was discussing. And Madam Chairman, we've had this conversation before. You may recall I've been advocating that the Fed normalize interest rates for a long time now. One of my deep concerns is that central banks around the world, very much including our own, seem to be trying to compensate for an inability of the political class around the world to address what's really holding back economic growth, which are fiscally unsustainable budgets. In our case, and I would argue in much of the rest of the world, avalanche of new regulations that is holding back economic growth, high marginal tax rates that discourage savings, work, investment. And the fact is, central banks' monetary policy cannot make up for those problems. In fact, you could argue, in some case, they can make it worse. Now we see the markets, as of this morning, appear to be pricing in an expectation that there will be no further increases in the interest rates that the central bank controls. They may be right, they may be wrong, but that's the expectation now. And there is this discussion, since the rest of the world is pursuing ever further this new chapter in radical monetary policy, we have this discussion about negative interest rates. And I appreciate the fact that you, in your discussion with Senator Corker, pointed out that there might be some serious concerns. I find it very, very disturbing to even seriously consider moving in that direction, and I hope we could talk about some of the potential risks of negative interest rates. Because I think there's a qualitative difference, and I'd like to get your thought on this, between, say, a 25 basis point movement in Fed-controlled rates, a movement that takes you from a low positive rate to another low positive rate, versus one that crosses the threshold into the negative. Above and beyond the psychological effect, right, I think most of us have grown up our entire life with the expectation that there is an absolute floor to interest rates. That would be shattered, and that might have unanticipated consequences. But there are practical consequences, too, and I'm hoping you could comment on some. For instance, it would seem that it would crush net interest margins for banks and perhaps dramatically diminish their ability to provide capital. I don't know how a money market business survives at all if there is a sustained period of negative interest rates. I could see adverse effect on business investment. Investors would be pressured to move further out the risk curve, even further than they've already been pressured. It put the U.S. deep in the midst of a global currency war, which is won by he who debases his currency the most. And I would suggest that the results where it has been tried have not gone so well. Sweden's had negative interest rates since 2009. They've got a massive property bubble. The Eurozone area generally has had negative interest rates since June of 2014. GDP growth has been very, very weak. Japan recently instituted negative interest rates, and as you saw, among other problems, they recently had a completely failed auction. They had to give up on auctioning off JGBs, so I guess we just monetized the debt. It seems to me there are a lot of potential problems, and I wonder if you could first confirm that for a layman, when we talk about negative interest rates, if that's imposed on savers, we're talking about savers having to pay a bank in order to take their money on deposit. Isn't that equivalent to a tax on savings? And could you just comment on some of these other problems?
So in the European countries that have taken rates to negative territory, well, I will say I was surprised that it was possible to move rates as negative as some countries have done. I think we have not in those countries seen actual fees levied on depositors. I may be wrong about, there may be some experiences there that I'm not aware of, but I don't think there's been broad-based pass-through of negative rates to at least small depositors.
And if banks resist that, then that just means their margins are crushed.
Their margins have been squeezed. A low interest rate environment generally tends to push down net interest margins. Now, they adopted it because they were concerned about inflation running very much below their objectives and wanted to stimulate the economy in order to achieve those objectives. So there were reasons that they adopted it. In our own context, when we considered this in 2010, we were concerned about potential impacts on money market functioning and didn't really think it would be possible to bring them to very negative levels. And before we were to take a step like that, we would have to think through all of the institutional details and how they would work in the U.S. context. I think as a matter of due diligence and preparedness, these are things we need to work through, but we don't even know if payments and clearing and settlement systems in our context would be able to easily handle negative rates. So
and just a
we've
very
not
quick follow-up,
studied
Mr.
that.
Chairman, and I'll be finished. But isn't it also true that there's an internal memo at the Fed from, I think it was August of 2010, raises doubts about whether the Fed has the legal authority to impose negative interest rates?
No, so there is a memo from 2010, and what it really said is that the legal issues haven't been studied. It was silent on the legality. It was a memo that discussed market functioning and economic issues connected with it, and the legal issues had not been vetted. I am not aware of any legal restriction that would mean that we could not establish negative rates, but I will say that we have not looked carefully at the legal side of this.
I'd like to submit that memo to the record, Mr. Chairman, and just quote very briefly from, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Among other things, the memo does say, and I quote, "There are several potentially substantial legal and practical constraints." In another part of the letter it says, and I quote, "It is not at all clear that the Federal Reserve Act permits negative IOER rates." So obviously there was a question in somebody's mind.
Right. It had not been seriously studied, and at this point, I'm not aware of a legal constraint. But again, with this, we have not run that through a careful legal analysis.
Thank you very much.
Senator Warner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.